The Todd Shapiro Show.
Time to hit the button!
On Canada Talks, SiriusXM 167. The time has come for CEO Profiles.
My man, the one and only from Lifted Innovations, as we document him running a company from startup to IPO and everything that's going on in the space. Brandon Ward's here. Hey, buddy.
Hey, Todd. How you doing, brother?
I'm good, man. Whereabouts are you at?
I'm keeping it San Diego this week, brother. I know that the weather's about to turn, so I might be up in Toronto a lot more in the next month or so.
Yeah, make sure you get here when it's nice. So, what I gotta right away, right off the bat, being an entrepreneur, running a company, all these kind of things. It's sort of what everyone always wants to do, right? I don't want to work for the man. I don't want to just work a 9 to 5, and I want to take some control. Does it take a certain personality type to do that?
For sure, man. And I mean, I think that's a bit of a misconception. The idea that, you're going to start a business and entrepreneur and you're going to be working on a beach sipping pina coladas somewhere, I think is a little unfair, because if you're going to build a business, man, if you're going to get to that point, you're going to put a ton of time and effort in. There's actually a security working for other companies. Like, you get to walk away. Most people get to walk away at the end of the day, right? But when you're running a company, you're owning a company, whatever you're doing, that's yours all the time, no matter what. You can't just kind of turn it off and walk away, man. There's a lot more responsibility that comes with that. So you got to be willing to get in, man, roll your sleeves up and hustle. I think, what's the saying? If you don't want to work 40 hours a week for others, be ready to work 80 hours a week for yourself. I'd say that's true.
And Brandon Ward, who's hanging out with us from Lifted Innovations, and we always sort of get these great little catch-ups and everything that's going on. When you work 80-hour work weeks, or even probably longer for you, and you never have that ability to kind of really shut it off, what advice do you give to those? And we've touched on this a little bit in the past, but do you have like concrete advice for those to be able to make sure you can compartmentalize?
Yeah, no, I think for me, when I first started here, we had a small team. Like I said, there was 3 of us. I was working a lot from home. And what I found is that I function at a much higher level and have much more peace of mind when I'm at home, when I separated my workspace from my home space.
Yeah.
So some people, they might have an extra room in their house, but I go to a shared space here in San Diego. And, the connections you make, the energy of people running around and hustling, it's contagious. And for me, it helps me to stay focused. I know we're kind of big on working from home now a lot of these days, but truthfully, I'm not a fan of it. And I think just having clear distinctions between your work and your home life, for me, was something that I implemented that made a huge difference, not only in my productivity, but also in my ability to relax when I'm at home in the evenings.
We always hear this word startup, a startup company, startup this, startup that. Does anyone even really know what that, like, what's a startup company?
It's always being discussed. Is it your revenues? Is it your time for how long you've been around? Is it the amount of money you've raised or how many people you've hired? Personally, I use startup in more of a broad way. I think it's very loose. I think you could be a startup even 3 years in. For me, a startup is something that is still establishing themselves in a market, and it's not a tried and true business that's really owned a portion of that market, whatever sphere they're in. Until you really get that ownership, man, from my perspective, especially these young, growing companies, like I still consider us a startup, even though we're at 12 people, we have revenues, we're growing, but by no means have we established ourselves as like a true lasting pillar in the space that we're in. That takes, from my perspective, years, man, and a lot of commitment and hard work.
Liftedinnovations.com, dealing and dabbling within the cannabis space, of course. And I read a report just very recently, Brandon Ward, that the marijuana is now the fastest growing job sector in the United States. And that's a pretty significant thing with the United States adding almost 65,000 full-time legal cannabis jobs. And that's a 44% increase in the workforce, in the weed workforce from 2018. Again, meaning it's the fast. Meaning it's the fastest growing job sector. Is it in working in the space and saying you're involved in the space? Is it a thing that for, is the stigma gone? Are people excited to hear about people who work in the space, or they're still like, oh, I can't believe how dare you be working in that with the devil's lettuce? How dare you?
The devil's lettuce. That's great, dude. That reminds me of like that. Have you ever seen that Reefer Madness video, Todd, back in the day that they made, like that government propaganda thing?
Oh, God.
Oh, my God. It's hilarious now watching it, but I can only imagine how horrified people were when that came out. But being Southern boy from West Virginia, I've got to say that my family and their response to the industry that I'm in and the work that I'm involved in has definitely changed over the past 5 years, right? So I've been in this space officially for like a little over 5 years now. And when I first started in it, they thought that I was going to go to federal prison, all these kind of things, right? All this fear around it. And we were, I was in the vaporizer space, so not even necessarily directly touching the plant, right?
Yep.
So it just goes to show you that stigma. But now, man, like when I go home or I talk to my family, my dad, good, hardworking, blue-collar guy in the power industry back in West Virginia, he's so proud now, of what I'm doing, and he tells his buddies what we're doing, and the stigma is definitely changing. I mean, a lot of states, even though they're not recreational, Todd, especially in the U.S., there's still medicinal qualities to a lot of the plants, even in very conservative states like West Virginia. There's reduction in criminal, like the way they prosecute relating to marijuana now and cannabis. So, it's definitely changing. And I think, honestly, dude, a lot of it is if alcohol's allowed, then there's no reason that cannabis should not be. Everyone has a person in their life that they can look to that knows they consume cannabis and they still have a functional life and they're not a drain on society. You know what I mean? So, like, the stigma is definitely changing, which is good, dude. It's progressing.
And Brandon Ward, who's hanging out with us, our CEO profiles and always inspirational and learning about entrepreneurship. Do you think this will be a platform, you being a resident of the United States and your business being predominantly in the United States, do you feel like this will be a platform that a Democrat might run on in terms of federally legalizing it towards as we start to head towards the next election?
Yeah, I think 2020 is going to be a very interesting election year just for that reason alone. One of those things, because it's really starting to fall on that tipping point period, right? I think there's 36 plus states now that have some form of legalized cannabis, whether it's medical or recreation. That's over a majority for sure. So I think it's inevitable. And ultimately, no matter your moralistic stance on cannabis and what it is, ultimately the tax revenue in the city and kind of localized organizations that can benefit from tax revenue, man, I think will just ultimately outweigh that moralistic kind of conservative-based viewpoint that it's had for such a long time. The propaganda is falling away, man. The internet just like demolishes a lot of the nonsense that's been propagated about cannabis.
And you're right. The internet helps sort of just spread the information now that we want. Internet not always great for everything, but I think there's just a lot of online information that people can access. Does cannabis know politics? If you know what I mean, like are we starting to see? Does the stigma in what side would support it? Is that starting to end too?
Yeah, I think so, man. Because it's just really becoming an economical thing at this point.
Yeah.
I don't even know what the moralistic arguments are anymore. At one point there was this idea that it was like, like you said, what'd you say, Satan's lettuce or cabbage?
The devil's lettuce. How dare you? How dare you smoke? Yeah. How dare you have the damn devil's lettuce? That stuff smells like a skunk in the yard.
Yeah, dude, exactly. Like,
we ain't smoking skunk dung, are we? Why are you bringing this into my home?
There's a funny scene in the second Harold and Kumar where they have a guy pretending to be George Bush, and he's supposedly got this like Afghani Kush, man, and it's hilarious. Like it always makes me think.
My intern's like dying laughing right now. My intern is dying laughing with that reference.
Bilal.
No, my guy Zach, Bilal's like, producer, but
nice.
Yeah. Oh, man.
Oh, nice. Right. Yeah. Zach, the intern. I love, by the way, every time Zach's on the phone, he's like, Zach, intern. I love that. That's like he's established himself. Zach, you're doing a great job, by the way. So are you, Bilal.
Yeah. No, we train the interns to make sure they tell everyone that they're interns. That's the way I run it. I run a pretty hardcore ship here, Brandon. I'm CEO of the Todd Shapiro Show, but I don't. There's no HR in my company. You're the intern. We tell them.
It's very defined that you got a hierarchy there, and you define your military man. That's you got a hierarchy, right? You got to honor the chain of command.
I think so. I hope so. I mean, it's not to say that someone can't ever suggest anything to the leader, but the leader is the final say. Is it like that? Well, we ask you about this all the time when you manage a big team and not to micromanage. But at the end of the day, as CEO, you're the one who makes the tough calls, right?
Well, I mean, ultimately the CEO is the guy with the head on the chopping block, too, regardless of what it is. Ultimately, people look to you for accountability and answers and all of those things, regardless of may be happening, it falls to you. So that's why you get that's the kind of the magic of being CEO. But like I was telling, like you at the beginning, Todd, early in the interview when you asked, I mean, I think there's a lot of ideas around what it means to be a CEO and running in this kind of romantic idea, and there is very romantic elements to. I mean, I really this is the most enjoyable, fulfilling position I've ever had, and I'm doing what I'm doing. But dude, it's hard, you know what I mean? And you kind of have to be a little crazy to want to do this. I think we always glorify the good stuff, but ignore the reality that, man, it's ultimately the buck stops with you, and it's whether you deliver or not is really what people care about at the end of the day.
A lot of accountability on the CEO's end, for sure. We often take that for granted. We got a call just coming in here. John from Michigan. Hi, John.
Hey, Todd. How are you, sir?
Good, buddy. Brandon Ward's on the phone from Lifted Innovations. You have a comment or question for him?
Absolutely, Brandon. And I think, Todd, you may not be familiar, but I'm sure Brandon is. There's certain areas of West Virginia and eastern Kentucky that have been just oversaturated with opioid painkillers. And, Brandon, I think what you're doing down there is tremendous. And if we can get more people off of opioids, and I'm sure what you're doing for the economy, because I know the economy has taken a hard hit in that area too, but getting people involved in good-paying jobs and getting people off of opioids, I think is tremendous. And thanks for what you're doing.
John, I appreciate that, man. That means a lot to me. And I got to tell you this, there's a lot of growing up in West Virginia, I've seen a lot of that. A lot of my family members have had truthfully, close family members have had struggles with opioid addictions, fentanyl addictions. I mean, that stuff is very, very destructive to the human body, and it is. I really appreciate you saying that, because to me, that is the way I see it. There's a lot of benefits economically and health-wise, and I'm just glad to see that the world's coming around to recognizing the power that it has, and I've personally seen benefits. Guys, if I could explain, like the amount of military veterans that have spoken to me about how they've been able to get off prescription drugs based on their relationship with cannabis and using high-quality vaporizers and things of that nature, it's so rewarding. It's rewarding, and it's humbling, John. So that's great, man. I really appreciate that.
You're welcome, sir. Thanks, Todd.
Yeah, John, of course, thanks for the call, my man. And Brandon Ward, thank you for always being so absolutely candid with us. I think that's one of my favorite things about getting to know you and having you call in and or drop in when you're in town, because you mix from San Diego to Toronto here with Lifted Innovations, having offices in both, which is, you show, even you just opening up about your family members. I think, we always have these images of big, tough CEO types who don't share any of that information. And they almost are robotic in nature, but fearful in nature as well. And yet you're like kind of this new wave, that's not afraid to be genuine. And you always say it, and it's a quote I use of yours all the time now, which is sort of the one where you talk about authenticity being the new currency. And I think it's just a really important one, because when people learn it from guys or ladies, of course, such as yourself, and these big higher up positions, that filters down to having a whether it's a community or whether a workplace or an employment of those who are working for big companies or small companies, transparency and honesty. And we ultimately help people by being like that, because if you're ever doing anything out of fear, it's not good for your mental health. And that's one thing we all are definitely comfortable in saying. So thank you for always sharing everything that you do, Brandon.
Well, I appreciate that, Todd. Very well, man. It like you said, I think it's nice to see that we're, moving and progressing as a society, and I think being honest and vulnerable, if you will, is actually a sign of strength. So it means a lot to me that you said that. And it's always a pleasure, brother. So I look forward to catching up with you next week, Todd.
Thanks, dude. Unless you marry a Russian woman like I did, they think that vulnerability is just very unsexy. I'll tell you that one. It's very unsexy for my wife. She wants James Bond, and not someone who's crying that I'm going a little bit balding in the back of my crap. Anyway, thanks, brother. Brandon Ward from Lifted.
Have a good one, brother.
Okay, cheers. Brandon Ward from Lifted Innovations.
This is the Todd Shapiro Show on Canada Talks, SiriusXM 167.